Alright, once again, another deck profile. After waiting for so long for my stuff to come in, I finally got excited to see my new Bladmire stuff. Because Bladmire is one of those decks I had since it first came out, and I'm definitely excited to see an evolved form of it, especially on one that is very similar to the character. From a person that doesn't see any meaning of life, to one that actually felt like it has something. And you could see it through the art as well, from a Grim Reaper to a more angelic-like looking Reaper. At least more with a sword, with a knight, which is something I like, and in a way, because it looks a little bit like Rezael as well, it's a very awesome little take here and very fitting too because lore reasons, if I remember correctly, Bladmire was created through Rezael's corpse, hence now we got technically Bladmire Nexus, and it was Rezael in the anime that defeated Bladmire and showed him the way that there is a purpose of life. And Rezael is basically life. Very fitting here. Just overall, I love Bladmire's design and aesthetic from the beginning, especially on the powerful divine skill, and its playstyle of completely banishing everything, which the new Bladmire still retains. Basically, it's a improved version of the original, just with few little tweaks. And just like the other divine skill users, technically it inherits the divine skill of the original, which of course means that you can still put your opponent to nothing while you still get something, because the little bit of the change of the skill actually represents having a little bit of a something. And that little bit of a change actually helps out the deck a bit. But other than that, there's really not much to say about the deck other than it's basically going to be the same as the original. But now, it's time to go on to the strong and weak point about the deck. So first off, the strong point is that, yes, it does have powerful attacks, but the weak point is that it's still short on counterblasts. And 2, you're going to be soul charging your main key units into your soul, so you might be short on attacking units by chance. But there is a new strong point of a new card that helps you out with that, which will be explained later. But anyway, with all that out of the way, let's just begin with the deck profile with, of course, the Rye deck. So, starting off with the starter, Cavity going on to the grade 1, Hollow Raptor, where when the grade 2 rides on top of it, look at top 3 cards of your deck to put all the grade 1s and highest into your soul, put the rest at the bottom, and if you put at least 2 cards, you draw a card. Yes, you have to soul charge your key units while putting all the triggers back to your deck, which technically is a strong point about this deck as well, because yes, you have more triggers in your deck, but because of having key pieces in your soul, it might suck, especially if you can't get them back from soul. But anyway, to the grade 2, Velvet Fang, which does exactly the same thing, where when the grade 3 rides on top of it, you soul charge the top 3 cards of your deck that are grade 1s and higher, and then you shuffle your deck instead of putting it to the bottom, and then if you soul charge at least 2, you draw a card. Another thing I need to mention about this part is that the draw is actually quite important because the deck also lacks draw power in a way. So hopefully you do get the draw as well, while also being able to retain some of your key pieces. And then finally, Faded 1 of 0 Bladmire. So when it attacks the Vanguard, bind at least 2 cards from your soul face down, up to 4. And then for every 2 you bind face down, plus 5k. And then if you bind at least 4, your opponent chooses 2 of their rear guards to bind. And then you also draw a card as well. So basically, it's pretty strong on its own already, because you can, of course, mass remove your opponent's board, which is actually a very strong part about this deck. Yes, it is basically Soul Blast 4, and it's a permanent Soul Blast 4, although with the new one, not exactly permanent anymore, while also retaining a bit of draw power and extra power to itself. The extra draw power is very important because the deck in many ways does lack draw power. But having ability to remove your opponent's rearguard, pretty nice, even if your opponent gets to choose it. But the second skill is the main part because your whole entire point about your first skill is to build up for the second one, which is the divine skill, where at the beginning of the guard step, if you have at least 8 face down cards in the bind zone, you can activate this divine skill, where it gives you crit +1 and your opponent is blocked from using Sentinel, while your opponent's Vanguard from the next whole entire turn is nullified from all their skills and their abilities. So basically, their Persona Ride, their Twin Drive is nullified, meaning they're only going to be single drive checks by default, unless they ride on top of it. And also no skills for your opponent in the next turn as well, so depending on scenario, your opponent can be stuck. And also this skill being basically a complete finisher is pretty nice overall. And if it doesn't finish your opponent practically can't do anything unless they ride. So I really love this powerful divine skill, even though it requires 8, but by the time you hit 8 and you're going to play this divine skill, you're practically going to use it during the finishing turn in the late game, so it's kind of fine. But overall, basically the first skill kind of builds up to the second one, and in a way the first skill can still handle its own, but the whole point is of course go to the divine skill, and if you don't finish your opponent in that divine skill turn, you might start being a little bit lackluster. In which now we go to the main deck, where we are not going to Persona Ride to the original because we're going to Persona Ride into the new one, into Bladmire Nexus. So it is treated as the original, which is actually helpful for the Persona Ride part. And during your turn, while you have the original in soul, it inherits the divine skill and it gets plus 5k power for the whole entire front row rear guards. From having nothing into having something into a Nexus. And inheriting the divine skill is pretty nice because by the time you ride this, you are going to have that divine skill because first grade 3 ride, you're not going to obviously have the divine skill. Sometimes you will because there is a way to do it, but you're not going to do it. And then second ride, which is going to be from this, which is going to be your turn 4 ride, this is practically going to be the turn you're going to do divine skill. And then giving the front row plus 5k, which is also pretty nice because it does beef up some numbers. And this is what I mean about a little bit of character development because Bladmire used to be alone, hence why his skill is kind of pretty much solo, while this one actually shares some power with everyone with his angelic power. So I really love that already. But the second skill, it's an act once per turn instead of on attack. You bind 4 cards from your soul face down, or you can bind a Bladmire from your soul face down. To be realistic, you are not going to bind the Bladmire face down on the first grade 3 ride that you ride on Nexus because you're going to need it in soul. And 2, you're going to need the 8 anyway in your bind zone. So your opponent chooses 2 of their rear guards and bind them face down. And then for every 2 cards face down in your bind zone plus 5k. So it's basically like the original, but here's the change. You can either draw a card or choose a face down card from your bind zone and call it. So instead of just drawing randomly, you can choice call something from the bind zone, which is very nice because you're going to be soul charging a lot of your key pieces that binding them face down is not bad anymore. And you're going to be choosing something from your face down bind zone that you're going to be randomly soul charging anyway that could have been useful to call. Usually it's going to be Vedrock. I'm going to be realistic. So this is actually pretty nice. You can now practically choice plus now while also having an alternate way of a cost and sharing more power. Now it doesn't do exactly too much different from the original Bladmire, but it does improve it a bit. But it does kind of suck that you have to guarantee bind 4 face down if you're going to do that, while the only alternate condition is literally just bind a Bladmire face down compared to the original where you can choose from 2 to 4. Now having the timing of act does make a difference because that means that it's not on attack bind, which the on attack bind can suck sometimes because your opponent can intercept first. Like I said, it's basically a small improvement to the original while having huge character development. And now to continue with the grade 3 lineup, the single strike Shadow Colossus. This is one of your ways where you could actually get 8 face down bind in your very first grade 3 ride, which wouldn't even really matter anyway, but it does help. Especially because of its skill where, with this card text, while you have at least 4 face down cards in the bind zone plus 10k, and then at the end of battle, put this to soul, in which it will trigger the second skill, or you could trigger it other ways. Where, when it's put to soul by a card ability, even from its first skill, while you have at least a grade 3 Vanguard Bladmire, bind this card face down to draw a card. So basically on attack, huge power buff, put it to soul, and then use a skill to bind it face down to draw. And you have 2 of these, that's 2 more cards face down in the bind zone, which combining it with another card will actually make it into 8. But it's very nice for some extra draw power, it's a big beater, and in a way, it's another call target from your bind zone if you need it. And so that's it for the grade 3 lineup. To the grade 2 lineup, so we still run the Zamoog. First skill, you might not use it too often, but it does help because when placed on rearguard, if you have at least a grade 3 Vanguard Bladmire, you can counterblast 1, look at top 3 cards of your deck to choose any number of them to put to soul, and of course shuffle your deck after. And then if you put any card to soul, you draw a card, which can be helpful to fill up, of course, soul and draw. But the second skill is the main part where on attack, if you have at least a grade 3 Vanguard Bladmire, you can Energy Blast 3 to give it plus 5k and 1 crit, as long as it doesn't have an additional crit during the attack. So basically, if you give it a critical trigger, you cannot get the skill. So you can give it power and then no crit, and then you can play this skill. Basically, it gives you some early game attack pressure, which is actually what the deck kind of needs because you want to pressure your opponent as much as you can to make sure that your guard restrict can basically be unblockable. And having that rear guard pressure with extra crit is actually very nasty. So this is a must run for. And then another must run for is the Veldrock Dragon. So Veldrock, for every 4 cards face down the bind zone, plus 10k, which is actually very nice, because this will become a huge beater on its own, or in a certain engine's case, it's going to be a huge booster, with the second skill where on placed on rear guard, other than during battle, you can soul charge 1, and then you can counterblast 1. Choose a card that is grade 3 or less with a different card name from this card and call it to rear guard. And then if your Vanguard is not a Bladmire, you must put that card to soul. So for this deck's case, if you are not on your grade 3 turn, you must put that card back to soul. But so basically you can use this for some early game attack, but you're not really good to do that. But this is also basically your main recovery engine because you're going to be soul charging a lot of normal units into your soul. So just having your soul as a resource is just very helpful, and being a big beater on its own is just very helpful. So you just must run for this. And even if you soul charge this, because it says on place on any means, you can call this from the bind zone and basically trigger its skill. This is one of your main targets for Bladmire Nexus, so you just have to see it. And then next, this lineup could be whatever, but I personally like this one because it actually helped me out quite a bit, which is the Crimson Expector. Because on attack on the Vanguard, you can soul charge 1. I like this because of the early game pressure that you can do on your opponent, especially on your grade 2 turn where you could just attack with it and then just give you soul, and having that build up soul is just very helpful. I might even bump this up to 3 just because of more soul. But the second skill is also very helpful, mainly to build up your Vanguard's power because you can counterblast 1 and put this to the drop to soul charge 1, and then your Vanguard just puts 10k power, which during the divine skill turn that you're planning to do could actually be very huge, and it could make it unblockable practically. Now, yes, it does still cost a counterblast, but to depend on scenario, you might actually end up using it just to finish off your opponent anyway, while also being a decent early game use of early game soul charge and early game attacking. That's why I kind of like this card, and I'm thinking about bumping it up to 3. Even though I don't really see many people playing this, I do actually find use for this card. And then a little final engine I like to play is the hostage part. 1 grade 2 unit and then 2 of the order, just so you can give your units boost ability, and it's going to be mainly for your Vedrock because Vedrock is going to be your huge booster for basically your Zamoog or any other attack. You can run this engine if you like. If you don't like it, you can run that new grade 2 that can count as boost and also get some extra power, but it's only going to be 15k. And finding myself having a lot of grade 2s anyway, I think this is a fine engine to run. In fact, I might take this out for the Crimson Inspector or just run a 3rd copy of the set order. And now to the grade 1 lineup. So here's the 15k booster for Bladmire, which is the Invoke Alchemist, which the unique skill is that when it boosts the Vanguard Bladmire, you can counterblast 1 to choose one of your rear guards to stand it, giving you a 4th attack. And if you have at least 8 cards in the bind zone face down, plus 15k, this is your only way to get an additional attack. So it does help, but do still watch out for the counterblast, especially depending on matchup. You might not want to use this counterblast or skill, but I personally like to have that extra 4th attack because it just helps. And into another new card, Elaborate Wizard. This one is a very helpful card that actually kind of saved the deck a bit because, well, it has the Underworld Ling ability on the first skill where placed on rear guard, look at top 2 cards to your deck to choose one to go to soul and the other go to bottom. With the second skill where at the end of battle this card boosts while you have at least a grade 3 Vanguard Bladmire, you can counterblast 1, bind this card face down, and then choose a normal unit from your soul and put it back to your hand. And that includes Sentinel. That is very huge because basically any unit that you're basically soul charging that is a normal unit can now go back to your hand. That includes Persona Ride, Sentinel, and another huge thing is that it binds itself face down, so combining it with Colossus makes it possible for you to divine skill on your first grade 3 ride, which you're not going to do, while also being a choice soul charge engine, which is also very nice as well. So yeah, it's a must run 4 of just because of that, while in a way you can do a divine skill on your first grade 3 ride and basically recycling from soul, which could even include your PGs. Now just keep in mind it says normal unit, so Sanctitude cannot be put back to your hand with this. And then finally, the Netherworld Butcher. So on placed on rear guard, if your grade 3 is Bladmire, your opponent cannot intercept during the turn, and then when this card boosts, you choose a card from your drop zone to put to soul. So it's just another way to get you more soul, but this time, because now you have more stuff that can choose stuff from soul, choosing your soul pretty wisely is very helpful, especially if you decide to choose Colossus just for more draw power. And then finally, 4 PGs, and I chose the 4th one being a PG instead of Sanctitude just for the Elaborate Wizard. And then finally, the OT, 8 crits for full on pressure, 3 draws because you desperately need the draw power and you might still deck out, but you just desperately need the draw power. And finally 4 heals, 2 being counters. And so that's it for this deck profile on my Bladmire Nexus deck. What do you guys think of it? What other cards would you recommend and what other changes would you make? So far, I've been liking the deck how it is. The deck still practically functions the same way, with still the same issues of counterblast basically, and now even more counterblast issues. But in a way, it's a small improvement to basically a deck that has been asking for Evolve 4. And I also love the character representation of the Evolve form as well. Just overall, just awesome stuff. Still focuses on the same stuff with some small tweaks and just more power. But in that, there's really not much to say about it because it kind of just does the same thing as the original, and it is still quite an expensive deck just because it is popular. But hopefully, they do make a countercharge in the future for this deck because the deck desperately needs one. But in that, that's it for this, and see you all next time.